700 Club, a deadly strike at sea. Iran is being blamed for a drone attack on an Israeli-run ship off the coast of Oman. That killed 2 men. A grave mistake. That's what Israel's prime minister is calling this latest attack in the war between wars. So what happens next? And what impact will Iran's new president, so-called hangman of Tehran, have on negotiations? Here's Chris Mitchell with more.
Israel says an Iranian suicide drone armed with explosives hit the Mercer Street ship, killing its Romanian captain and a British security officer. An Israeli-owned company manages the vessel, and on Sunday, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett warned Iran.
So I state here absolutely. Iran is the one that carried out the attack against the ship. Iran's aggressive behavior is dangerous, not only for Israel, but also harms international interests, the freedom of navigation, and the international trade. The intelligence evidence for this exists, and we expect the international system to make it clear to the Iranian regime that they have made a grave mistake. In any case, we know how to convey the message to Iran in our own way.
In a statement, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken blamed Iran for the attack and stated, "We are working with their partners to consider our next steps and consulting with governments inside the region and beyond on an appropriate response, which will be forthcoming." While Iran denied responsibility, the attack is the latest in a series of strikes at sea between Iran and Israel. In the meantime, Ibrahim Raisi will be sworn in as Iran's new president on Thursday. Called the hangman of Tehran for his involvement in the death of thousands of Iranians, it remains to be seen what impact he will have on negotiations over the renewal of the Iranian nuclear deal. Talks have been suspended for the past 6 weeks. U.S. Secretary Blinken says the delay can't go on forever.
The ball remains in Iran's court, and we will see if they are prepared to make the decisions necessary to come back into compliance. We are committed to diplomacy, but this process cannot go on indefinitely.
And many believe the election of Raisi could mark the beginning of an even more dangerous period between Israel and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Pat?
Chris, tell us about this new president. Why is he considered so dangerous?
Well, Pat, he's called the butcher or the hangman of Tehran for a reason. He's responsible for maybe 3,000, some believe as many as 30,000 deaths in 1988 of political prisoners. He also reflects the supreme leader's stance to take a more hardline approach against the West. A big test, Pat, is coming up to see how he's going to deal with the nuclear talks. He's skeptical of those talks, and he'll have a new negotiating team, and it remains to be seen, how that's going to work out. But, Pat, he's also a firm believer in the return of the Mahdi, the Shiite Messiah, and he says the Mahdi is the savior of mankind, and he's looking for his appearance.
Well, Chris, Iran is increasingly using these drones. What role do these weapons play in this so-called war between wars?
Well, Pat, they're a big part of their conventional arsenal. They have a range sometimes of up to 1,600 kilometers or about 1,000 miles. We were in Saudi Arabia in September of 2019. They call that the Pearl Harbor of drone warfare, where they had multiple drones attacking Saudi Arabia's largest oil refinery. We were there, Pat, to see that. And it's really just one part of a shadow covert war between Iran and Israel right now. As you said, it's called the war between wars. Earlier today, we had a briefing with General Amos Yadlin. He's a retired general, and he said it's really all dimensions. It's on all fronts. It's maritime, it's cyber, terror attacks, Iranian proxies in Iraq and Syria. It's all over the Middle East, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. And so both sides are attacking each other. But so far, both sides don't want a full-scale war. But one day, Pat, it could break out into a war. And we say this a lot, but it's one reason why we believe it's very important to be praying for the peace of Jerusalem.
Chris, thanks for your insights. We appreciate it. Chris Mitchell in Jerusalem. Well, at long last, senators unveiled a nearly $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure package. So what's in it, and will it pass? And what is AOC threatening to do with the deal if it doesn't make the House? Here's Dale Hurd.
Pat, the 2,700-page infrastructure bill cost about $1 trillion and would improve the nation's roads, bridges, power grid, internet, and drinking water. But it also includes $66 billion for passenger railways and $21 billion for what's called environmental concerns. But for Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and progressive Democrats, it's not enough. Next up is $3.5 trillion in a budget reconciliation bill that includes massive new social programs. While moderate Democrats aren't yet ready to sign off on that bigger bill, progressives say they're ready to scuttle the bipartisan deal without it.
And I said we will go on budget resolution. Let's look at the whole bill. But don't forget, we've got inflation. We've got a $28.6 billion debt. We have $4 billion a day growing in debt. All this should be considered before we just jump in.
There is not a reconciliation bill in the House. And if the Senate does not pass the reconciliation bill, we will uphold our end of the bargain and not pass the bipartisan bill until we get all of these investments in.
This morning, another headache for Democrats. The moratorium on evictions expired over the weekend, meaning millions of Americans could be forced out of their homes, Pat.
Dale, how many millions of Americans may be facing eviction under this problem?
By one study, as many as 15 million Americans are behind on their rent, and perhaps between 3 and 5 million face immediate evictions. So courts could be very busy today. Now, on the other side of that are landlords. Some of them, as you know, are not wealthy people. And throughout this process, they've been owed a collective, I think, $20 billion, but they've had to continue paying taxes and, in some cases, mortgages. Congress has allotted some rental assistance, probably enough to cover this problem, but states have been slow to dole it out.
Dale, thank you very much. Well, in other news, President Trump put 3 conservative justices on the Supreme Court. So conservative votes rule, right? Not exactly. Jennifer Wishart explains.
Pat, this latest term of the court has taught us that not all conservatives are created equally. Instead of seeing this 6-3 split between conservative and liberal justices, some of the court's biggest decisions have shown more of a 3-3-3 split.
I think the most conservative members are Justice Thomas and probably next Justice Gorsuch. And close by is probably Justice Samuel Alito.
In the middle, making up a more centrist coalition, Chief Justice John Roberts, Brett Kavanaugh, and the newest justice, Amy Coney Barrett.
We learned that Justice Amy Coney Barrett was not the judicial torpedo that a lot of Democrats believed she was going to be on things like Obamacare.
In that case, led by the more centrist conservatives, the court chose consensus over striking at the heart of the matter. Likewise, in Fulton versus City of Philadelphia, the court ruled unanimously that the city was discriminating against a Catholic foster care agency, but stopped short of addressing the larger issue of religious liberty. That led a frustrated Justice Alito to write, "This decision might as well be written on the dissolving paper sold in magic shops."
Their job is to decide whatever case is before them and not create these cockamamie schemes of what will happen in a decade.
A recent Gallup poll shows 49% of Americans approve of the job the Supreme Court is doing. Republicans and Democrats view it similarly, revealing Americans are both pleased and frustrated with its rulings. Finding that equilibrium of public opinion is what some observers say drives the middle of the court to issue narrow opinions and decline some controversial issues. Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett joined the 3 liberal justices to refuse hearing the case of Barronelle Stutzman, a Washington florist forced to use her art to celebrate a same-sex marriage. Meanwhile, Gorsuch joined the 3 centrists to block hearing a transgender bathroom case out of Virginia.
The court's conservatives, at least 3 or 4 of them, do not want to get bogged down in the transgender issue. I think they want to stay away from it.
Still, next term, the court will tackle several hot-button issues like New York's handgun law and an abortion case out of Mississippi that strikes at the heart of Roe v. Wade.
The fact that they have relegated this decision to one question on whether or not pre-viability restrictions are constitutional indicates to us that they are going directly to the heart of the matter and will make a determination as to whether or not Roe was good law.
So how will this new alignment on the court play out? Blackman has a prediction.
I don't think there are enough judges with the backbone to do it.
And Pat, this case out of Mississippi is exactly what pro-life supporters have been waiting for as a vehicle in hopes that the court will use it to overturn a constitutional right to abortion in this country.
Jennifer, you know, years ago when that ruling came down, it was so palpable that the police power of the states under the Constitution controls about abortion that should not have ever been federalized. Roe versus Wade was called Blackman's abortion, and it was based on material from Planned Parenthood. So what do you think the moderates are trying to accomplish? It looks like a couple of them, I mean, Kagan, for example, was dean of the Harvard Law School. What do you think?
Yeah, well, you know, Pat, it looks like they're looking at the long game here. They're taking this incremental approach, baby steps toward where they think the law ought to be. But in the meantime, you have Americans suffering. I mean, I pointed out Barronelle Stutzman in the story, Jack Phillips, the cake maker, you know, in Colorado that we've reported on, you know, a lot. You know, these people are having their constitutional rights infringed upon, spending years of their life draining their savings account defending themselves while the court is taking this approach. And so some of the people I've talked to have called it an arrogant approach. You know, and they're them saying that basically they have more power than they think they do, and that they need to go ahead and get this done because, look, Pat, the Constitution isn't changing. It hasn't changed. It was written 200 years ago, and so they need to just take the case that's in front of them, apply the Constitution, and move on instead of worrying about public opinion.
Jennifer, I talked to a legal scholar, and I said, what's wrong with Roberts? He's supposed to be a conservative. And he said 2 words, Chevy Chase. The Chevy Chase Club has gotten to him, and he's trying to please them. Did you think that's maybe the case, or do you know?
Well, it could be. I mean, I think we certainly saw him change a bit when he was Justice Roberts and then when he became Chief Justice Roberts. And we see, Pat, I mean, you look at the Fulton versus City of Philadelphia case. It looks like he was really trying to build consensus around this case. That was a unanimous decision, but it only applied to that narrow circumstance in the City of Philadelphia where this Catholic foster agency was being, discriminated against. And so that's why we saw Justice Alito being frustrated, saying, look, this is not worth any of the paper it's written on because it doesn't address the bigger issue of religious liberty. And you could go down the line at other, cases like that. Chief Justice Roberts, by the way, was the person who wrote that opinion. And so we've also seen him, staunchly defend Obamacare. And a lot of people can't figure that out. And so I think you may be right about that.
Well, Jennifer, I appreciate it, and we'll keep watching and praying. I mean, we've got a president who's nominated a number of conservatives to the Supreme Court, and yet at the same time, they don't seem to want to take a bold stand. And the biggest time when they passed was in ruling on the last election. They refused to even consider it. They said that the plaintiffs, although they represented about 30 different states, they didn't have, quote, standing, and therefore the justices wouldn't consider it. So you just say, has anybody got some intestinal fortitude?